If you've been around my channel for a while now, then you know I'm a big proponent of old school bodybuilding training methods to build muscle. Basic mass gain training principles that have been around since the beginning of bodybuilding. To summarize my training style, in short, would be higher frequency training, hitting body parts 2 to 3 times per week, higher volume training, more than what you would find in a typical high intensity training plan or low volume training system, and training just shy of failure to allow for higher volumes and higher training frequencies. Now, one question I get asked all the time is, hey Pete, since you're a big fan of old school bodybuilding training methods, what do you think of Mike Menster's style of training? Or specifically HIIT training, or as Mike referred to his style of HIIT training as heavy duty training. Now, before I give you my opinion, I have to preface this by saying that Mike's training recommendations had changed drastically over time. And in the beginning, some of his methods were a bit more practical, but eventually he had some crazy routines that he put out there. Some of the more memorable ones, like his consolidated training routine, where he has you doing literally one workout every 5 to 7 days. There were 2 separate workouts in that routine. The first one, squats, pull downs, and dips, all done for 1 set each to failure. That's 3 total working sets for the workout. 5 to 7 days later, you'd come back for your second workout and you do deadlifts, behind the neck press, and standing calf raises. Again, 1 set on each exercise, 3 total sets. And that's the entire routine. Needless to say, that's extremely minimal training. Later on, he eventually even recommended training with more of a split body part system. But again, only hitting the gym once every 5 to 7 days. That took almost a month to hit each body part again. And it's been a really long time since I've looked into Mike's training recommendations, so don't quote me on any of these specifically, but I can tell you for sure, he advocated waiting as long as 5 to 7 days in between each individual workout to hit the gym again. But now, going to the subject of this video, why HIIT training won't work for you. If you're following these crazy recommendations and protocols that Mike recommended, especially later in his career, then I don't really think there needs to be much explanation as to why the style of training is not the best way to go about it. But let's back up a little bit and talk more specifically about HIIT training itself and why it fails to produce results for so many people. Let's start with the basic philosophy of HIIT training. It's very simple. A low amount of sets, focusing on progressive overload through extra weight, extra reps, or a combination of both. And all these sets are performed with a very high level of effort. The term failure training is almost always associated with HIIT training. But let me tell you something. This word, failure, this is the exact reason that HIIT training won't work for you. The exact reason? Most people just don't understand the term failure, and they apply failure training incorrectly over and over again, both in the gym, during their training, and when designing programs and using the term itself incorrectly. Now, what do I mean by that? The basic definition of training to failure is when you take the target muscle through a set to the point that you could no longer produce the same amount of force at that point in time. The end result, you cannot produce another rep until you take a rest period. So if you take your 10 rep max on bench press and you perform that set to true failure, by the time you get to rep 7, the weight will start to slow down. By 8 or 9 reps, the weight's moving extremely slow. By the 10th and final rep, you could barely lock out that weight. And at this point, another rep would be impossible. That's true failure. You had 0 reps left in the tank. But what if you kept going and you tried to get an 11th rep and you completely missed that rep? That would be failure training, but that's not the same. This is because you trained past failure and you actually missed the next rep that you went for. This didn't build any more muscle, it put you at a higher risk for injury, and it caused a disproportional amount of nervous system fatigue without any additional benefit. Now, Mike Menster, he was a huge proponent of training to failure and even beyond failure. He called those the growth reps. And his whole idea of training was that you want to hit failure and even train beyond using static holds, drop sets, rest pause sets, negatives, and he even advocated taking that muscle to the point that you could no longer even hold or lower the weight. Again, all these things, they create an extremely disproportional amount of fatigue to the body. This is one of the quickest ways to leave you drained and over fatigued. And Mike was aware of this. This is why he only advocated training once every 5 to 7 days. Your body just needs so much rest in between these types of training sessions. But that's not ideal for building muscle. That only helps with relieving your nervous system fatigue. And if you've had any experience with HIIT training, you've likely tried some of these crazy methods. And I bet you're not alone. you've most likely experienced what most people do with this style of training. That includes being burnt out and even weaker than before you started the training due to lack of recovery. Not only that, the extremely low frequency training usually leaves you very rusty. And the problem that I'm getting at here is this style of HIIT training is what most people associate with the term HIIT training or high intensity training. But there's actually many other people who do advocate for much more practical versions of HIIT training. Some big names as well. The number one example that I get on a regular basis when talking about HIIT methodologies is Dorian Yates. Yes, he built one of the most massive physiques on the entire planet, and he used HIIT training principles. He trained to failure often and trained extremely intense. But if you look at his actual workouts, what do we actually see? We definitely see that he trained with a bit higher volume than something like Mike Menster recommended. And while Dorian did include some crazy intensity techniques like beyond failure training, but what do we see when we look at most of his sets, especially his big compound lifts, the ones that generate a ton of central nervous system fatigue? Most of those sets, we actually see him take to form failure or technical failure, not to the point where he's purposely missing reps in the gym just to take his body even further. Go watch Blood and Guts. See what his sets looked like when he performed things like barbell rows and deadlifts. He's taking those sets to the point where he could no longer perform another solid, clean rep, and then he puts the weight down. Sure, there's plenty of intensity techniques thrown in there on his other exercises, things like drop sets, forced reps, negatives, but those are more isolation exercises and less systemically draining movements. The point I'm trying to drive home here is Dorian picked his battles, and although he did sustain injuries and he did beat up his body, but he also knew that he could still get all the benefits from technical failure training and didn't always have to go beyond the point of failure. But another point that's obviously valid, there's only one Dorian Yates, and most humans, especially the average population, are not recovering from that style of training, especially Dorian's level of intensity or the crazy methods that Mike Menster recommended. But there's plenty other examples. Dante Trudell, great example, one of the OGs in the bodybuilding community promoting low volume, heavy progressive weight training. For any of you who don't know, that's the DC or dog crap style of training. And Dante's actually gone on record to say that dog crap training is nothing that he actually wants associated with high intensity training or Mike Menster's style of lifting. He focuses on hitting true failure, but the main focus of the program is heavy progressive training. And if you ever watch any of his guys lifting, whether it's old footage or guys that follow his philosophies today, you'll see them taking each set to the point that they could no longer produce another clean rep. And even with the use of his rest pause style of training, where he would actually have 3 failure points in each set, if you actually watch guys perform this set, the ones that are getting good results from the system, their intensity is sky high, but they're stopping each failure point where they could no longer produce another clean rep. Very rarely are they missing reps in the gym, and they're not getting stuck under the bar from attempting reps that they definitely couldn't complete. So to summarize, the term failure itself could be the exact reason why HIIT training is not working for you. With HIIT training specifically, or any style of training that matter, you need to understand the exact intensity of each set that's required of you to perform the training. And this is exactly why I very rarely tell people to purposely train to failure, because they assume they need to get stuck under the bar in a set. Now, something like 0 reps in reserve or AMRAP, as many reps as possible, that's actually what most people mean when they tell you to train to failure in the gym. But too many people train way beyond this point, and that's exactly why failure training doesn't work for you. It'll leave people overtrained, burnt out, and under-recovered. Now, if you're someone who likes HIIT training, prefers that method, or have a time constraint and you prefer shorter, high-intensity workout sessions, and you want to get more out of the HIIT style training system, my advice for you, forget about the term failure. Replace it with 0 reps in reserve or AMRAP, as many reps as possible. Forget about training to the point where you miss reps. Go for the last clean rep you can. Train to the point where you no longer have any reps left in the tank. That's a big difference. But regardless, do I personally think that HIIT is the best way to train to build muscle? No, I don't, especially not for most people. And if you find yourself personally not getting the most out of a HIIT style training system, as again, it's not for everyone, and you want to get the most out of your training to build more muscle, using the methods that I personally use, the ones that I feel are the best for maximizing muscle, using higher frequencies, higher volumes, and leaving reps in the tank. The same style of training used by the majority of bodybuilders in the 60s and 70s. They all built their physique using these basic old school bodybuilding training methods. The same ones that you can find down below in my 5-day old school mass gain training plan. And as always, if you guys want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.